"Look at you," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over. "I've been watching you, trying to see what makes you think so highly of yourself. But I can tell you, I see nothing special. Nothing that should make you so proud and full of yourself." "Do you even know who I am?" he asked, his voice rising with anger. Ogo met his gaze without flinching. Her voice was steady as she replied, "Yes, I know who you are. You are the proud, rude, arrogant, and a terrible, womanizing prince." Once upon a time, in the lush and vibrant kingdom of Obu, nestled in the eastern parts of Nigeria, there lived a remarkable king named Amadi. The kingdom was a land of endless green fields, with rivers that sparkled under the warm sun, and forests filled with the songs of birds and the rustle of leaves. Obu was a place where nature thrived, and so did its people under the watchful eye of their beloved ruler. King Amadi was known far and wide for his immense wealth. He possessed vast treasures of silver and gold, and his cattle roamed in great numbers across the plains. No king before him, nor any after, had ever been as prosperous as Amadi. His riches were not merely inherited, they were the fruits of his own labor. Even while his father was still alive, Amadi had worked tirelessly, his hands never idle and his mind always sharp. He had built his fortune with sweat, determination, and a keen sense for trade and agriculture. But King Amadi was not just wealthy, he was also wise and just. He ruled his people with a heart full of compassion and a mind full of understanding. He knew their pains, their struggles, and their dreams. Whenever his people faced hardship, King Amadi was there, offering support in every way he could. He was more than just a king. He was a father to his people, guiding them with kindness and protecting them with strength. His reign was a golden age for Obu, a time of peace, prosperity, and happiness. King Amadi was blessed with a beautiful and loving wife, Queen Soma, and together they had 3 wonderful children, 1 strong son and 2 lovely daughters. The royal family was the heart of the kingdom, and their home was always filled with warmth and happiness. In the evenings, the royal garden would come alive with the sound of their laughter. The king and the queen would gather their children under the shade of ancient trees, where they shared old tales passed down through generations and exchanged jokes that brought smiles to their faces. It was a time of togetherness that anyone would envy, a picture of perfect family bliss. However, beneath the surface of this serene and joyful life, something troubled King Amadi deeply. His heart was heavy with concern for his son Ebube. As the firstborn and the heir to the throne, much was expected of Ebube, but he was becoming everything his father had feared. Instead of growing into a noble and responsible young man, Ebube had become proud, wayward, and arrogant. He seemed to care little for the duties of royalty or the values that his father held dear. Ebube lived a life of excess and indulgence. He spent his days in idleness and his nights in reckless partying, drinking, and flirting with several maidens from the village. Extravagance became his way of life. He squandered his father's wealth without a second thought, surrounding himself with friends who only encouraged his wild behavior. Every night, he would stumble back to the palace drunk and bringing shame to his royal lineage. A royalty does not live a wayward lifestyle. King Amadi would roar in anger whenever Ebube returned in such a state. But no matter how much the king scolded him, Ebube remained unchanged, his behavior growing worse with each passing day. While the kingdom thrived, the future of its leadership was uncertain, causing the king and queen sleepless nights. "This boy has decided to be useless," the king would lament to Queen Soma. "I wonder what we are going to do with him." When anyone, whether a wise elder or a concerned servant, tried to reason with Ebube, he would dismiss them with a wave of his hand and a careless laugh. "My father is so rich," he would say. "I have everything I could ever want. What do I need to work for?" These words cut the king deeply. Sometimes in his darkest moments, King Amadi found himself wishing he had another son, one who would be worthy of the throne, who would lead with wisdom and honor. But this was the burden he had to bear, for Ebube was his only son, and despite all his flaws, he was still the king's blood and hair. One warm evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the village, Prince Ebube paraded through the narrow dusty paths as he often did. The village of Obu was known for its beautiful maidens, and Ebube, with his love for women, never missed an opportunity to bask in their admiration. Wherever he went, the young girls of the village would gather in clusters, giggling and whispering to one another, hoping to catch the prince's eyes. They adored him, not just for his royal status, but for his handsome features and the charm he exuded effortlessly. Sometimes, a lucky girl would catch his attention, and he would grace her with a smile or a few sweet words. Other times, he would ride past without a second glance, unimpressed by the faces that greeted him. On this particular day, something unexpected happened. As Prince Ebube made his way through the village, his eyes fell upon a maiden unlike any he had seen before. She was heading towards the stream, her graceful movement and striking beauty captivating him instantly. Her name was Ugo, a name that meant pride, and she embodied it perfectly. Ebube felt his breath catch in his throat. Never before had he seen such beauty. She was radiant, her skin glowing in the evening light, her eyes deep and full of mystery. As she walked past him, Prince Ebube, for the first time in his life, felt the need to stop someone in their tracks by himself. He called out to her, his voice laced with confidence of a man who was always obeyed. But to his shock, Ugo did not even glance his way. She continued walking, her gaze fixed ahead, as if he were nothing more than a passerby. Ugo had heard all the stories about the prince, the tales of his flirtations, and how he toyed with the hearts of the village girls. She had no interest in being another conquest. Prince Ebube was stunned. What just happened? How could she ignore him? Prince Ebube, the son of King Amadi and the heir to the throne of Ou. He quickly regained his composure and called after her again, this time with a command in his voice. "I am talking to you and I command you to stop." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Ugo never paused, never turned, never acknowledged him at all. She walked on, leaving the prince behind, standing alone in the middle of the path. As Ugo disappeared from sight, Ebube's shock turned into anger. His pride was wounded, something he had never experienced before. How dare she, a simple village girl, ignore him? Who does she think she is? The shame of being disgraced in such a way burned within him. He clenched his fists, vowing that Ugo would regret the day she dared to disrespect the Prince of Ubu. He would find a way to bring her to her knees, to make her understand just who she had slighted. That evening, Prince Ebube sat with his friends under the large ancient tree that stood tall in the palace courtyard. The tree had been there for as long as anyone could remember, its wide branches spreading out to provide cool shade. The prince and his friends often gathered there, laughing, chatting and drinking from their wooden cups. But today, something was different. As the evening sun cast long shadows on the ground, the prince sat quietly, his face clouded with sadness. He stared at his drink, not even taking a sip, lost in his troubled thoughts. One of his friends, noticing the prince's unusual silence, leaned forward with concern. "Why are you so sad, my prince?" he asked gently. The others, who had been joking and laughing, also grew quiet, sensing that something was wrong. Prince Ebube let out a deep sigh, his shoulders slumping. "Can you believe it?" he began, his voice filled with frustration. "A girl from this village had the nerve to turn me down. Like she looked at me from my head to toes, and then she just walked away, like I was nothing." His voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Who does she think she is? I am the prince of this land, and she dared to disrespect me. I will make her pay for this." The young men exchanged shocked glances. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. Who was this girl who had the guts to insult the prince? One of them, eyes wide with surprise, spoke up. "My prince, do you know who this girl is?" Prince Ebube nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, I had one of my guards follow her. She lives at the very edge of the village. Her name is Ugo." At the mention of her name, the group of friends gasped. "What? Ugo?" they exclaimed in unison. They looked at each other with a mixture of fear and respect. One of the men, shaking his head slowly, said, "My prince, that girl is not like others. She is beautiful, yes, but she is also very strong-willed. Ugo doesn't mix with many people, especially not with men. She keeps to herself, always minding her business. I think you should let this go. It might not end well." But Prince Ebube's pride was too wounded to listen. His eyes flashed with anger as he stood up, his fists clenched. "I am Ebube," he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtyard. "I am the son of King Amadi, the greatest king of this land. No man, no woman, not even Ugo can insult me and get away with it. You all just watch and see what I will do." With that, he stormed off, his footsteps heavy with rage. His friends watched him go, their hearts heavy with worry. They had only wanted to tell him the truth, to warn him, but now they could only mutter quietly to themselves, hoping that the prince's anger wouldn't lead to something they would all regret. The next day, as the first light of morning began to peek through the trees, Prince Ebube was already awake, sitting tall on his horse by the edge of the forest. The early morning air was cool and fresh, filled with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. This path, shaded by the thick forest, was the one the villagers used to get to their farms. The prince had heard that Ugo, the girl who had dared to insult him, always took this path early in the morning, So he had decided to wait for her, determined to block her way and confront her. He wanted to know who she thought she was, to treat him, the prince, with such disrespect. Time seemed to drag on as he waited, his patience wearing thin. The sun was slowly rising higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. Just as he was beginning to grow frustrated, thinking that she might not come after all, he finally saw her. Ugo was walking down the path carrying a basket, just as she always did. As she came closer, Prince Ebube's anger started to fade, replaced by something else. She looked so beautiful, almost like a goddess, bathed in the soft morning light. Her skin glowed like the sun itself, and her steps were light and graceful. The prince couldn't deny the truth. He was smitten by her beauty. But even as he admired her, the memory of how she had torn him down still burned inside him, reigniting his anger. Determined to confront her, Prince Ebube pulled on the reins of his horse, turning its back to block her path. Ugo stopped when she saw the horse in front of her, but she didn't look scared. Instead, she stood tall, her eyes calm and steady. In a polite voice, she asked, "Please, may I pass?" But the prince wasn't ready to let her go so easily. He glared at her, his voice sharp and mocking. "Look at you," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over. "I've been watching you, trying to see what makes you think so highly of yourself. But I can tell you, I see nothing special. Nothing that should make you so proud and full of yourself." "Do you even know who I am?" he asked, his voice rising with anger. Ugo met his gaze without flinching. Her voice was steady as she replied, "Yes, I know who you are. You are the proud, rude, arrogant, and a terrible, womanizing prince. And just so you know, I do not think highly of myself. But I'm not interested in anything you have to say. I won't be like those village girls who follow you around, hoping for your attention. Can't you handle a simple rejection? Or do you think the whole world revolves around you? Your status doesn't impress me. Now, please, can you kindly move out of my way?" The prince was taken aback, his anger flaring even hotter. "Me? Rejected?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "Do you even think you are worthy of my attention? You should be glad that I'm speaking to you at all. You are nothing but a poor, hungry orphan girl, not even fit to tie the laces of my shoes. And just so you know, I wasn't interested in you. I like you. I thought you looked hungry and needed some food. But now I see that you need something else. Proper training. Your dead parents should have done a better job before they died." With those cruel words, the prince turned his horse sharply and rode away, heading back to the palace, his heart still burning with rage. Ugo stood there, frozen in place, as his words echoed in her ears. Her eyes filled with tears that she couldn't hold back. How dare he mention her parents? That was a wound that had never healed. She looked down at herself, wondering if she really looked as starved as he had said. Her parents had died when she was very young, leaving her to fend for herself. She had always been strong, but the prince's words cut deep, reopening old hurts as she continued her walk to the farm. The tears kept falling, soaking the earth beneath her feet. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the atmosphere was tense. King Amadi was fuming with anger, his face red with frustration. His precious golden chain, the one he treasured above all his possessions, was missing. This wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was a priceless heirloom, passed down to him by his beloved father. The chain held deep sentimental value, a symbol of his family's legacy, and losing it felt like losing a part of himself. The king's anger echoed through the grand halls of the palace. Servants tiptoed around cautiously, afraid of being caught in the storm by his fury. Everyone knew how much the king cherished that chain, and the thought of it being lost or stolen was enough to make him rage. Just then, Prince Ebube stormed into the room, still bowing with anger from his earlier encounter with Ugo, the maiden who had insulted him in the village. But before he could utter a word, the king's voice cut through the air, sharp and demanding. "Who took my golden chain?" the king growled, his eyes blazing with fury as he looked around the room. Prince Ebube froze in his tracks. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The room fell silent, the weight of his father's anger pressing down on him like a heavy burden. "I said, who took my golden chain?" the king repeated, his voice growing even louder, filled with impatience and rage. Finally, after a long tense pause, Prince Ebube lowered his head and spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "I'm sorry, father. I sold it." The king's eyes widened in shock. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "What? You sold what?" he shouted, his voice trembling with disbelief. That chain was not just an ordinary chain. It was a gift given to me by my father. It's part of our family history. How could you do such a thing?" Prince Ebube, now realizing the gravity of his actions, pleaded with his father. "I'm sorry, father. I truly am." But the king was beyond forgiveness. His voice was cold and filled with finality as he spoke. "No, sorry is not enough this time, Ebube. You must find that chain and bring it back to me, or I never want to see your face in this palace again. Do you hear me? I've had enough of your reckless behavior. If you do not return with that chain, you are no longer my son." The queen, who had been standing quietly by his side, suddenly fell to her knees, her heart breaking at the harsh words of the king. "My king, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "He is our only son. Do not do this. Please, do not send him away like this." But the king, still consumed by his anger and pain of losing something too precious, refused to be moved. "I don't care," he shouted furiously. "He must leave this house and only return when he has found that chain. If he cannot do that, then he is no son of mine." With that, the king turned his back, his mind made up, leaving the prince and queen in a state of shock and despair. The weight of the king's words hung heavy in the air, and the once lively palace now felt like a place of sorrow and loss. All attempts to calm the king's anger were in vain. The king's fury was like a raging fire that couldn't be put out. No one could change his mind. He ordered the guards not to allow Prince Ebube back into the palace. And to add to the humiliation, the king personally stripped him of his princely robes and threw him out of the palace gates. It was a moment of deep shame for the prince. He stood outside feeling more humiliated than he had ever felt in his life. The golden chain he had sold for money to party with his friends was now the cause of his downfall. What was he going to do now? He had no money, no plan, and no idea on how he would ever get the chain back. Sitting alone outside the palace gates, the prince felt confused and lost. He had never imagined that his own father, the king, would treat him so harshly. The palace, once his home, was now a place he was forbidden to enter. As the day turned to evening, desperation began to set in. He decided to swallow his pride and ask his friends for help, hoping they would lend some money to him to get back the chain. But to his dismay, one by one they all refused. Each had a different excuse. Some claimed they had no money. Others said they couldn't help at the moment. Prince Ebube was heartbroken. He had always been generous with his friends, sharing his wealth and throwing lavish parties for them. But now, when he needed them most, they turned their backs on him. They wouldn't even offer him a place to stay for the night. It was then that he realized the truth. These so-called friends were nothing more than fair weather friends, only around when things were going well, but gone when he needed them the most. As night began to fall, the prince was still outside, tired and without hope. He returned to the palace, thinking that maybe, just maybe, his father would change his mind if he begged once more. But the king's heart remained cold, and the palace gates stayed firmly shut. Feeling utterly defeated, Prince Ebube decided to walk down to the village stream. He thought maybe one of the village girls who used to admire him so much would take pity on him and offer some help. As he walked through the village, the girls who once giggled and chased after him now whispered behind his back. They couldn't believe their eyes. Prince Ebube, the mighty prince who used to ride through the village on a grand horse, was now walking on foot like an ordinary person. How the mighty have fallen, they whispered, some in pity, others with mockery in their voices. The news of his fall from grace had spread quickly through the village, and the girls no longer chased after him. Instead, they laughed and turned away, now seeing him just as an ordinary man with nothing to offer. The prince's heart ached as he reached the riverbank. He sat down by the water, watching the ripples and thinking about how his life had changed so suddenly. It hurt him deeply that no one wanted anything to do with him now that he was no longer rich and powerful. He realized that all these people only cared about his wealth and status and not about him as a person. Suddenly, a voice popped into his head, a memory of something Ugo had said to him. I am not moved by your status or wealth. At the time, he hadn't understood what she meant, but now it was clear. She was the one, the only one who had seen him for who he really was, not just the prince with riches. He realized how foolish he had been. Now, hungry and desperate, he wondered if Ugo might be willing to help him. She was his last hope. With a heavy heart, he decided to visit her and try his luck. Ugo had just returned from a long day at the farm. Her hands were tired from working the soil, but she knew she had to prepare her evening meal. She was in the small kitchen of her hut, stirring a pot over the fire, when she happened to glance outside through the window. To her surprise, she saw Prince Ebube approaching her hut. Her first thought was, what does he want? After all, their last encounter had left her with a heavy heart, still stinging from the cruel words he had spoken. But as she watched him come closer, something seemed different this time. He wasn't wearing his usual royal robes, and instead of riding on a horse, he was walking on foot. What could have happened, she wondered, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion creeping into her mind. She remembered how he had insulted her earlier that day, mocking her and even speaking ill of her dead parents. The pain of those words was still fresh and she wasn't in the mood to forgive him easily. She braced herself, ready to confront him if necessary. As the prince reached her hut, she could see the worry etched on his face. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a look of desperation. It was clear that something was terribly wrong. "Please," the prince began, his voice shaky and full of regret. "I'm sorry about what I said this morning. I didn't mean any of it, and right now I really need your help." The words felt heavy in his mouth, but he knew he had no other choice. He was no longer the proud prince. He was just a desperate man seeking help. Ugo couldn't help but laugh at the sight of him, the once arrogant prince now reduced to a humble beggar. She could hardly believe her eyes. Was this really the same Prince Ebube who had looked down on her with such disdain, or was she seeing a ghost? She hadn't heard any rumors because she had been in the farm all day, so she had no idea what had happened to bring him to her doorstep in this state. After a moment, Ugo finally spoke, her voice firm and cold. "I'm sure you do not suffer memory loss." "I can't help you," she said, turning her back to him. "I don't even care to know what you may need my help for. But do you remember what you said to me earlier today? Please, just leave." The prince's heart sank as he heard her words, but he was too desperate to give up. "I'm starving," he pleaded, his voice trembling with genuine need. "Please, I'm sorry. You are the only person who can help me right now." Ugo ignored him, focusing on her cooking, as if he wasn't even there. She stirred the pot, the smell of the food wafting through the air. But the prince refused to leave. He felt completely lost, with nowhere else to go. So, he quietly sat down under the shade of a nearby tree, his head in his hands, looking utterly defeated. His stomach rolled with hunger, but more than that, he felt a deep sense of regret and worry. He had nowhere else to turn, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it felt like to be alone and helpless. When Ugo finished making dinner, she noticed that Prince Ebube had fallen asleep under the tree, his head resting on his arms. Seeing him like this, without the usual air of pride, made her feel a pang of pity. She couldn't help but to wonder what had happened to bring the once proud prince to such a low point. After some thought, she decided to offer him some food and hear what he had to say. Ugo carefully dished out the food she had prepared, a simple meal of boiled yams and vegetables. Then she walked over to where the prince was sleeping and gently shook his shoulder to wake him up. "Come and eat," she said softly. The prince stared, rubbing his eyes as he slowly sat up. He was starving, and the sight of the food made his stomach growl even harder. But when he looked at the meal in front of him, it was clear that this was not the kind of food he was used to eating in the palace. The meals there were always rich, fancy, and prepared by the best cooks in the kingdom. He frowned and asked, "Is this the only food you have?" "I can't eat it." Ugo laughed at his reaction. "Remember, you are not in your father's house, and you begged me for this food. If you can't eat this, then you better go back home. This is what I can afford." The prince's stomach grumbled again, reminding him that he was too hungry to be picky. With a sigh, he realized he had no choice. He picked up the food and began to eat, though it was far from what he was used to. But as he ate, he found that the simple meal was more satisfying than he had expected. It filled his belly and gave him the energy he had been desperately needing. After dinner, Ugo sat across from him and asked, "So what happened? Why are you here?" The prince looked down at his empty plate, feeling a mixture of shame and regret. Slowly, he began to share his story with her. How he had sold his father's precious golden chain. How his father had discovered the truth and now he had been thrown out of the palace in disgrace. As he spoke, Ugo listened carefully, her expression softening as she heard the pain in his voice. When he finished, Ugo looked at him and seriously said, "I hope you've learned your lesson, Prince Ebube. It's not easy being humble, but it's something you need to learn. I will let you stay here for a few days so you can figure out how to buy back your father's chain. But understand this, I will not treat you like a prince while you are here. You will have to work and learn to be humble, just like everyone else." The prince nodded, his pride now completely gone. At this point, he was willing to do anything to make things right. He knew he had a lot to learn, and for the first time in his life, he was ready to start. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, Ugo was already awake and ready to start her day. She walked over to where Prince Ebube was still sound asleep on the mat, which was the only bed she had to offer him. It was clear from the way he slept on it that he wasn't used to such humble accommodations. His body ached from the hard mat, and he wasn't accustomed to waking up early. Back in the palace, he always rose whenever he pleased, with no one daring to disturb him. But things were different now. "Get up," Ugo said firmly, nudging him with her foot. "We are going to the farm today." Her voice was calm but carried a tone that made it clear that this wasn't a request. It was an order. Ebube groaned and muttered, "Farm? I'm a prince and I don't go to the farm." Ugo crossed her arms and looked down at him with a serious expression. "You are wrong," she said. "You are no longer a prince and you need to get this into your thick skull. If you were still a prince, you wouldn't be here in the first place. Princes live in the palace. You can't just stay here all day eating my food and doing nothing. You need to work for it just like I do. This is how I am able to feed myself, and if you want to stay here, you have to come with me to the farm. Otherwise, you have to leave my house this very minute." Ebube hesitated, his pride clashing with the reality of his situation. He had never worked a day in his life, and the thought of toiling on the farm was almost unbearable. But he knew he had no place else to go. He had been thrown out of the palace and his so-called friends had abandoned him. If he left Ugo's house, he would have nowhere to sleep, nothing to eat, and no hope of getting back his father's chain. Reluctantly, he prince sat up, rubbing his sore muscles. He knew he had no other choice. Fine, he muttered, still not fully accepting his new reality. I'll go with you. Ugo nodded, satisfied with his response. Good. Let's get going then, she said, handing him a simple hoe and basket. As they made their way to the farm, the prince felt out of place, carrying tools that were foreign to him. The road was dusty and the sun was already beginning to warm the air. He had always seen the farm workers from a distance, but now he was one of them. As they both walked through the villagers couldn't help but stare. They whispered amongst themselves, clapping their hands in amazement. Wonders shall never cease to end, they murmured. It was a sight they never thought they would see. The once proud prince walking through the village like an ordinary person, no longer dressed in fine clothes or riding a grand horse. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat became unbearable, scorching the prince's skin as he walked in the farm. He wasn't used to such hard labor, and the relentless sun made him miserable. This is too hard, he kept shouting, his voice full of frustration. Sweat poured down his face and his hands were already sore from holding the hoe. Ugo glanced at him and said, This is how people make money. You must keep working. Her words made the prince think. All this time, he had been spending money without care, living a life of luxury and never thinking about how the money was earned. Now he was beginning to understand why his father had always been angry at his extravagant lifestyle. Making money wasn't easy. It was hard, painful work. For the first time, he realized just how much effort went into the wealth he had taken for granted. When they finally grew tired and hungry, they found a shady spot under a tree to rest and eat. By now, the prince was too exhausted to even complain about the food. He simply ate, grateful for anything that would fill his aching stomach. As the day drew to a close, they headed back to Ugo's hut, both too worn out to speak. Their feet dragged in the dirt and their bodies ached from the long day of work. But when they arrived home, Ugo had more tasks in mind. You need to go fetch water from the stream while I cook, she said to the prince as they reached the hut. What? The prince's eyes widened in disbelief. You must be out of your mind, he exclaimed, his voice rising in anger. I am a prince. How do you expect me to carry a water pot and fetch water from the stream? All you've done is turn me into a slave. I will never stoop so low. How do you expect the villagers to see me fetching water like a commoner? Ugo couldn't help but laugh at his outburst. Hey, look at you, she said, shaking her head in amusement. So, you are still full of yourself. Let me remind you, you are not a prince in this house. This is my house and you must be useful here. It's either you assist me or you find somewhere else to go. I'm not going to put up with your nonsense. Ebube sat down in front of the hut, fuming with anger. Was Ugo doing this to get back at him? He knew he still had the royal blood running through his veins. But here he was, being treated like an ordinary person. Yet, deep down, he understood that Ugo was the only person who had taken him in when everyone else had turned him away. It was a shameful thought. Him, the prince, fetching water from the stream. but he realized he had no choice. With a heavy heart, Ebube finally picked up the water pot and headed for the stream. As he walked, he could feel the eyes of the villagers on him, and he knew they were laughing at the sight of the once great prince now doing such humble task. Ugo watched from the doorway, a smile tugging at her lips. It was a funny sight, seeing the prince struggle with the pot, but she hoped this experience would teach him how to be a responsible man. Back at the palace, the queen's heart was heavy with sadness. She had heard the rumors about how Ugo made the prince walk, going to the farm, fetching water from the stream, and even gathering firewood from the forest. It pained her deeply to know her son was enduring such hardships. "My king," she pleaded, "this boy has been disgraced enough. Can't you forgive him? I believe he has learned his lessons." But the king remained firm in his decision. "I am glad he has found someone who could teach him humility," he replied. "Let him stay there. He needs to experience the tough side of life so that he can learn how to be a better person. This is the only way he will truly understand the value of hard work and humility." Weeks had passed, and Prince Ebube had slowly started to adapt to his new life with Ugo. At first, he thought it would only be a matter of days before his father would send for him and bring him back to the palace. But as the days turned into weeks, no one came for him. Realizing that he was truly on his own, Ebube decided to embrace his new reality. He no longer felt ashamed when he went to the farm, fetched water from the stream, gathered firewood, or even swept and cleaned the house. As each day passed, he discovered that he could do all these things with surprising ease. In fact, Ebube found himself falling in love with farming. He enjoyed the process of planting seeds, caring for them, and watching them grow into healthy crops. It filled him with a sense of satisfaction and joy, a feeling he had never experienced in the palace. The scorching sun, which once seemed to torment him, no longer bothered him. Instead, it became a companion in his daily work, reminding him of how much he had grown. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Ebube and Ugo sat under the shade of a tree, resting and enjoying the cool breeze. Over the past few weeks, Ebube had come to understand and appreciate Ugo. She was a remarkable young woman who had learned to fend for herself from a very young age. He admired her strength, resilience, and fearlessness. Unlike the other women he had known, Ugo was different. She was bold, strong, and unafraid to speak her mind. She had opened his eyes to a new way of seeing the world. As they sat together, Ebube broke the silence. "I think I would love to be a farmer," he said, his voice filled with newfound passion. Ugo raised her eyebrow in surprise. "Interesting," she replied, a smile playing on her lips. She had noticed the way the prince had tended to the crops with such care and enthusiasm these past days. He wasn't the spoiled prince she had first met. In fact, he had begun to change, and she liked the person he was becoming. She found herself enjoying his company, especially when he made her laugh with his funny jokes. The past few days have been fun, and she was glad to see him thinking about his future. "So, what made you fall in love with farming?" Ugo teased, her eyes sparkling. "And you're getting pretty good at fetching water too." They both laughed, the sound of their laughter filling the air with warmth. "Stop it," Ebube said, grinning. "You know, tending to these crops gives me a sense of satisfaction. Planting a seed, nurturing it and watching it grow. It gives me the sense of achievement that I've never felt before." Ugo nodded, impressed by his words. "I'm sure you can do it," she encouraged him. "You don't realize it, but you're very strong. And look how well you've adapted these past weeks. Your father, the king, owns lots of lands. I'm sure he would be happy to give you some, especially now that you want to be useful to yourself." But as soon as Ugo mentioned his father, a shadow crossed Ebube's face. The thought of his father brought back painful memories. "I'm not sure he's ever going to take me back," Ebube said sadly. "I can't even raise the money to buy back his treasured chain. I feel like I'm destined to remain a commoner, working hard to make it my own way." Ugo could see the sadness in his eyes, but she couldn't help but smile at how well he had grown. She admired the way he was beginning to think like a man. "Well," she said thoughtfully, "I think I may have a solution. I've saved up some money, and we could give it to the goldsmith. I met him, and he hasn't sold the chain yet. Even though the money isn't enough, we could plead with him to give it to you. Then, when you return to the palace, we could find a way to pay him back." Ebube was deeply touched by Ugo's offer. Many people thought Ugo was tough, but inside, she had the kindest heart he had ever known. He reached out and gently took her hands, looking into her eyes. "You don't need to do that," he said softly. "You worked very hard to save that money, and you need it more than I do. This is my mess, and I should find a way to fix it. Besides, I'm not tired of staying with you." Ugo laughed, her heart lightened by his words. "You can't be serious," she said, shaking her head. "Let's just say I'm giving it to you as a loan, but you need to go back to the palace. You don't belong here." Ebube fell silent, his thoughts swelling. He had always imagined going back to the palace, but now it seemed impossible. He wasn't sure he wanted to leave. Over time, he had come to care deeply for Ugo, and he couldn't help but wonder if she felt the same way about him. Ugo was determined to help Prince Ebube, and so they went together to meet with the goldsmith. Thankfully, her plan worked, and they were able to get back the precious golden chain that the prince had sold. But on the very same day they got the chain back, something unexpected happened. Ugo fell seriously ill. Ebube couldn't bring himself to leave her, not when she needed him the most. He decided to stay with her until she was strong and healthy again. During the days that Ugo was sick, Ebube took care of her in ways he had never cared for anyone before. He cooked her meals, gently feeding her when she was too weak to eat on her own. He took on all the tasks that needed to be done, going to the farm, fetching water from the stream, and making sure she had the right medication. He stayed by her side day and night, watching over her with a love and tenderness that surprised even him. Ugo couldn't help but feel her heart swell with emotion. She had never experienced this kind of care before. Since her parents had passed away, she had always been alone, fending for herself with no one to rely on. But now, here was Prince Ebube, a man she had once disliked with so much passion, showing her more kindness than anyone had ever done. the way he looked at her, the way he stayed up late to make sure she was comfortable. It all touched her deeply. Tears welled up in her eyes as she watched him, realizing that she had opened her heart to him, something she had never done with anyone before. It was funny to her that the man she had once hated with all her heart was now the one she cared for the most. As the days passed, Ogo began to recover and Ebube was filled with joy to see her getting better. He had feared losing her, and the thought of it terrified him. Now that she was fine, he knew that there was no more need to hide his feelings. He had to speak from his heart, especially now that he had the chance. One night, as they sat together under a tree, the sky above them glittering with stars, Ebube finally spoke. "I once told you that you looked hungry and ugly," he began, his voice soft and full of regret. "But the truth is, even then, I was smitten by your beauty. It hurt me deeply that the most beautiful girl in this village turned me down. But now that I know you, I realize I am deeply in love with you. I am not sure I can live without you." As he spoke, he gently cupped her face in his hands, his eyes searching hers for a response. Ugo was speechless, her heart pounding in her chest. She had also fallen deeply in love with the prince, though she hadn't fully admitted it to herself until now. Finally, she found her voice. "I love you too," she said softly, her words filled with emotion. "It will be sad to see you leave, but I know you don't belong here. I hope you never forget me, because I can't live without you either." Prince Ebube pulled her into a warm embrace, holding her close as the night wrapped around them like a blanket. The moment was filled with emotions neither of them had ever felt before, and they both knew that their lives had been changed forever. They had found something precious in each other, something that would stay with them no matter where life took them. Ogo couldn't hold back her tears as she watched Prince Ebube leave for the palace the next day. They had hugged each other more than 1,000 times, but it still didn't feel like it was enough. As he walked away, Ogo stood there waving until he was nothing but a tiny dot in the distance. Her heart felt heavy, knowing that the prince who had become so dear to her was leaving. When Prince Ebube arrived at the palace, the entire place buzzed with excitement. Everyone could see that something was different about him. He had changed in a way that was noticeable even from afar. The king was pleased, and the queen rushed to embrace her son, tears of joy in her eyes. They were both glad to have him back. Without hesitation, Prince Ebube knelt before his father and handed back the golden chain. His voice was filled with sincerity as he pleaded for forgiveness. "These past months," he began, "have learned great values, and I am ready to be a better person. I'm sorry for all the pains I've caused you. Thank you for driving me out of the palace. Because of that, I have seen life for what it truly is, and I am ready to face and fight for my future." King and Queen exchanged looks of amazement. Was this really their son? They could hardly believe the transformation. The king's heart swelled with pride, and he decided to throw a grand feast to celebrate the return of his son, who had come back a better man. In the days that followed, Prince Ebube sat down with his father to discuss his new plans. He told the king that he wanted to become a farmer. The king was surprised, but also excited. He couldn't help but to wonder what had happened to his son in just a few short months to inspire such a change. "What happened to you, my son?" the king asked curiously. Ebube smiled and began to tell his father all about Ugo, how he had met her, how she had taken him in when no one else would, and how she had taught him what it meant to be responsible and hardworking. The king listened carefully, impressed by the story, but he also noticed something in the way Ebube spoke about Ugo. "You love her, son, don't you?" the king asked gently. "Yes, father, I do," Ebube admitted. "But first, I have to prove to her that I'm a man who can take care of her without relying on your wealth. I want to show her that I can stand on my own 2 feet." The king was deeply moved by his son's words. "I will give you all the support you need," he said, his voice filled with pride. "I love the man you are becoming, and now I see a future king in you. Someone who is willing to fight for what he wants. And I already love this maiden Ugo, even though I haven't met her. I will be honored to meet the woman who helped shape you into the man you are today." In the months that followed, Prince Ebube threw himself into work. The king gave him acres of land, and the prince was determined to make the most of it. Day by day, he worked hard on his farm, planting crops and tending to the land with great care and dedication. Ugo was deeply impressed by the man he had become. She could see how much he had grown and how serious he was about building a future for himself. His crops flourished, and within a few years, Prince Ebube became wealthy in his own right. He was no longer the prince who depended on his father's riches. He had built his own fortune through hard work and determination. The village maidens who once ignored him when he was down on his luck now tried to win his attention again. But his heart belonged to only one woman, the woman who had helped him become a better man. As for his old friends, the prince had learned a hard lesson and chose to stay away from them. He had realized that true friends are those who stand by you in tough times, not just when things are going well. And so Prince Ebube continued to grow, not just in wealth but in character. He had found his purpose and knew that his future was bright, especially with Ugo by his side. One evening, under a sky filled with twinkling stars, Prince Ebube and Ugo sat together, talking and laughing. The night was peaceful and their hearts were light with happiness. As they sat close, sharing stories and jokes, Prince Ebube knew that the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. He could no longer imagine his life without Ugo by his side. Looking deeply into her eyes, he took a deep breath and said, "Ugo, will you marry me?" Ugo's eyes filled with tears of joy. She had dreamed of this day for so long, and now that it had come, her heart felt like it could burst with happiness. "Yes, I will marry you," she said, her voice trembling with emotions. She wrapped her arms around him in a warm hug, knowing that they were meant to be together forever. A few months later, they celebrated their love with a grand traditional marriage ceremony. The whole village gathered to witness the joyous occasion. The king and queen were especially happy, for they adored Ugo and were proud of the man their son had become. They knew that with Ugo by his side, he would become a great king when the time came. The celebration was filled with music, dancing, and laughter, and the villagers joined in the festivities, sharing in the happiness of the new couple. Prince Ebube and Princess Ugo lived happily ever after. When the time came, they became king and queen, ruling the kingdom with great wisdom and kindness. Together, they made their people proud, leading with compassion and fairness. And their love story became one that was told for generations to come. Hi besties, thank you for watching this story, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. Please do not forget to share your lessons in the comment section so that we all can learn from it. And if you are yet to subscribe to this channel, do not skip this video without subscribing and turn on the notification bell so that you get notified whenever we post new stories. Thank you so much for all your support, all your kind words, all your love. Like, it's just massive, and I don't know how to thank you enough for it. Right now, I'll have to go and see you in the next story. Bye!